And we're going to get started real quick here with Mark Easter. I'm really excited to hear his presentation. I found his book fascinating. My name is Pat Berger, and I'm currently the president of the Larimer League of Women Voters. First of all, I want to take a moment for us to contemplate and acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Apache, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, and the tribes of the Pueblo, Comanche, Shoshone, Kiowa, and Navajo. We acknowledge that this land remains the shared space among these people and ourselves. We recognize this shared ground and express our gratitude and appreciation to those whose homelands we are currently residing. I'm very pleased to introduce Jane Hamburger. Jane served as our president for 4 years, right, Jane? 4 years. And I learned so much from Jane. Indeed, I'm still learning. Jane now serves as the environmental team leader for our Larimer League. The environmental team is the sponsor for tonight's program. Please welcome Jane.
Tonight, both our audience here and in Zoom land are in for a delicious treat. Not directly for our taste buds, but more to feed our action reflexes. The environmental team, formerly known as EAT, is pleased to sponsor local author Mark Easter as he brings alive what he has researched and written in his award-winning book, The Blue Plate, A Food Lover's Guide to Climate Chaos. In it, he seeks to answer the question, can we eat our way out of the climate crisis? Mark is an ecologist and greenhouse gas accountant who has researched the carbon emissions from food, forestry, and fiber in academia and private industry for more than 2 decades. He spent much of his career working with farmers, ranchers, foresters, and scientists around the world, researching how historical and modern agriculture contribute to the warming climate, and identifying both new and old farming and ranching methods that not only reduce the dangerous climate emissions, but behind our daily plates of food, but reverse those emissions whenever possible by drawing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back into the Earth's ecosystems. Mark's scientific approach is first evident to us when he dedicates his book for the microbes, who are at work throughout his study. The Blue Plate, with its starring players, was published by Patagonia Books in 2024. It received a 2025 Gold Medal Award from the Independent Book Publishers Association, is a finalist for the Colorado Book Award, and a finalist for a James Beard Award. And he just keeps raking them in. Mark will be available for a book signing after the event. Bring Your Own or Firehouse Books is here, thank you, with copies to purchase tonight. Mark is a longtime resident of Fort Collins, Colorado, and spent much of his work and his career at Colorado State University until retiring in 2023, where he continues working as an affiliate scientist. He loves to read, work in his garden, cook, hike, backcountry ski, and spend time with his wife, Leslie Brown, and their Australian Shepherd, Bobby. The cards, well, I'm going to leave it up to Mark to tell you how he wants to handle the questions, both here and for our Zoom audience. So, because we want to, I know you're here to seek answers, so we want to make sure that happens. Mark, we do have an additional request that comes from our Informed Citizen Book Club, which featured the Blue Plate during the April 25 Earth Month. It is to ask if you could duplicate for us the shout you and Leslie shouted to the Italian farmers. We would love to learn it. Okay. So thank you, and please welcome Mark.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that introduction. There's a lot of people here to thank. And so first I want to thank Mary Beck, who got me connected with Cindy when I was traveling. I'm sorry I couldn't be here for the in April when the book event, or when you all were actually reading the book, but just delighted to be able to come here and join you all. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Jane. And Cindy Leinefelter originally reached out and made this possible, so I'm really grateful for that. And so many different hands made this possible. Jory and Kathy, who's helping run my presentation here, and then also Anatoly from the city TV channel. Thank you. So writing a book like this, I live here in Fort Collins. I've lived here since 1994, and my family goes back 4 generations here in Colorado. I started writing this book about 10 years ago and completed it about 2.5 years ago before it went into the book mill in Patagonia, turned the book crank, got the manuscript and created a book that came out of it. And I didn't realize it going into it that writing a popular science book is it's a community act. It takes a village to do something like this. There's so many people who are involved, and a couple of people I really want to call out here from Fort Collins. You might recognize some of these names. So Sue Ellen Campbell and John Calderazzo, both writers at CSU. Laura Pritchett, award-winning local author as well too. They played really central roles in helping this book come to life. Also, there were so many farmers and ranchers who actually are featured in the book, who lent their stories. And so the book is really about them. And I dedicate my readings to the farmers and ranchers, to the people who feed us, and everybody else who's involved with the harvesting, the processing, the shipping, because there's so much involved with the food system to bring the food to our plates. Next slide, please. So I want to also thank Anthony Mint. Anthony started an organization with his wife, Karen Leibowitz, called Zero Foodprint. Anthony wrote the foreword to the book. And I encourage you to all to take a look, go to their website, read about the good work that they're doing. And I was really grateful when he agreed to lend his own voice and his own story. Anthony is also a James Beard Award winner. He won an Impact Award in 2023, I believe. All right, next slide, please. So, can we eat our way out of the climate crisis? So I'm a greenhouse gas accountant, and I began this work in greenhouse gas accounting in 1999 when I joined a research group at CSU led by Dr. Keith Postjan. Keith and his colleagues colleagues of soil scientists and other ecologists, they had been working under the auspices of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. You may have heard that term before. Since 1992, when the Earth Summit occurred in Rio de Janeiro, and the countries of the world signed a treaty. It was called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but it's called the Earth Summit Treaty, the short version of it. But they did something that was really revolutionary at that time, and it led to this entirely new scientific discipline, the science of greenhouse gas accounting. They agreed at the time that they were concerned about the burgeoning climate crisis. They wanted to know how much of an issue it likely was going to be. They also agreed to count up what the greenhouse gas emissions of the individual countries were, and then report them to the world, to each other, using transparent methods, and then make sure that it was available to anybody who was interested in doing it. And that was an auspicious thing. People had been attempting what we called greenhouse gas inventories, adding up climate emissions And so a lot of work had been done up to that point, and the world was starting to understand that most of the emissions were coming from fossil fuels. But in the farming sector, in the agricultural sector, from ecosystems, we didn't actually really know what the emissions were. We had a general sense that they fell into some broad categories: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. But we didn't know how significant those were. We'd only known for about a decade that methane was actually a greenhouse gas. So there was a lot of work to be done. And I came into Keith's research group at the time that Colorado State University was just starting for the first time to do what we called a greenhouse gas inventory for agriculture. It was under contract through the Environmental Protection Agency. It was the very first of its kind to be done, and we were working in collaboration with scientists in Great Britain, Hungary, Italy, and other parts of the world at this time, trying to test out the methods that scientists had been working on since 1992 to understand what the emissions were. And it was a fascinating thing. And so I've got a section from the book in the introduction that I'd like to read to you that explains a little bit about what my experience was coming into this space. One evening in a grocery store after work, I selected a cucumber from the cool, misty shelves and stood for a while examining it. Earlier that day, I'd encountered new research describing the total collective carbon footprint of agriculture around the world. The numbers shocked me. The research reported that about a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world's collective carbon footprint came from growing, processing, distributing, and cooking food, and dealing with the leftovers. It was a stunning revelation into what has been described as agriculture's long shadow. And I'll just say that when that report came in, I didn't believe it. I walked it around to my colleagues, printed it out, the summary, and said, "Is this right? Do you believe this?" None of us, we were stunned by this. Beyond the cucumber were other items there: milk for morning coffee, meat for an evening meal, bread for sandwiches, tortilla chips and salsa, eggs, salad greens. They contain the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels burned to plant, harvest, and ship the crops, process them into foods, and to manufacture the fuels and the farm chemicals used to grow them. More carbon dioxide came from organic matter decomposed by microbes in degraded soils. Powerful trace gases like nitrous oxide from the fertilizers applied to the fields. Potent methane from the stomachs of the cows and from lagoons full of manure accumulating at dairies. A myriad of other sources. I don't know how long I stood there blocking the aisle, but in those moments, my view of food changed forever. What formerly had been to me this pure elemental thing, the product of evolutionary miracles, was suddenly tainted with the chemical stench of steel, diesel exhaust, and factory smokestacks. Not only that, but the individual whispers of microbes collected into a deafening roar of the powerful climate-heating trace gases all their tiny bodies emit. The sum total of it was enormous. For me, food transitioned from something soft and almost mythical into something entirely new, both cold and hard, with dimensions I'd never imagined. Since that day, a question has haunted me. Can we transform agriculture from a system that literally consumes the planet to one that nurtures and respects this home that is all we will ever know? Can we cultivate from the earth meals that nourish us, a blue plate of sorts, rather than the earth being the meal itself? All right, so I'm going to provide kind of a brief recap here of some of the themes of the book, and then we're going to go into questions. A lot of you, I understand, have already read the book, which I'm really grateful for, and I didn't want to come in here and talk about something that you were already familiar with. I really want to dive into things that you're interested in. And so I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, Anybody who has a question, there's cards and pens there in your seats. Go ahead and write those questions out. What we're going to do is compile those in a couple of minutes here. I'll also take questions from the Zoom and then work through those. And then we'll do a recap at the end. All right. So what is greenhouse gas accounting? This is a diagram from the book, and what we're essentially trying to do is do what we call a greenhouse gas inventory. And you can do a greenhouse gas inventory associated with the construction of this building or the construction of your home, from a tomato that you buy in the grocery store. You can do an inventory from an entire country or for a business. You just have to draw a box around what you're interested in understanding what the emissions are. And it's a powerful tool. We've learned to try to understand where the most important emissions are, and most importantly, what can be done about them. And what we've learned in the work that I do in agriculture and forestry is that the majority of the emissions come from microbes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But most interestingly, what we found is that the most cost-effective way to draw down carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and get it back into the Earth system turns out to be through agriculture. There's lots of chemical and engineering methods that are being done out there to try to capture CO2 and convert it either into liquid form or just concentrate it as a gaseous form or into some other chemical form and then store it somewhere else in the earth. They're very expensive. They tend to cost anywhere from 5 to 20 times more on a per ton of carbon dioxide basis than agriculture. And it turns out carbon is really at the center of that. Next slide, please. If you think about an ecosystem, and I want to ask you to think about, there's a lot of gardeners here and some farmers, some people, working in natural resources. Think about your garden plot. Think about it as an ecosystem. You've got all the elements there that you might see in a national park or the national forest in the Poudre River. You've got organisms that are primary producers, they're plants. You've got organisms that are grazers. They're going to be bugs and microbes. Some of them you want, some of them you don't want. Might be a little bit frustrated with. Rabbits, say for example, or the raccoons that come in and try to get my corn every year. We have all of those elements in the ecosystem. And what we're trying to do through regenerative agriculture is increase the carbon in the system. We find that as you increase the carbon capital into ecosystems, into farms, it actually increases the fertility. You see crop yields increase, the yields become more stable, the crops are better able to hold off diseases and also deal with pests like invasive weeds, those sorts of things. So greenhouse gas accounting is very much about trying to understand what the carbon flows into the system are and what the carbon losses out of the system are as greenhouse gas emissions, just like in a business, just like in financial accounting. All right, next slide, please. So I organized the blue plate around a plate of food. So think about a meal that may have meat, maybe dairy, bread or some type of grain, fruits. You might have fish, vegetables, and then also dealing with the leftovers. And so every chapter in the book, next slide please, every chapter in the book features a farmer or a scientist or an extension specialist or somebody working in policy who is one of the heroes or heroines of the regenerative agriculture movement. Next slide first, please. So Steve Ela from Ela Family Farms. Anybody eating his peaches? Yeah, wonderful stuff. He's over in Hotchkiss. He's one of the 4 Colorado growers that are featured in the book. Next slide. So Barclay and Tony Durrani from Indian Ridge farm out in Norwood near Telluride. They're growing pasture-raised poultry. Sunspot, next slide, please. Sunspot Urban Farm, Rod Adams and Amy Yackel from here in Fort Collins, growing wonderful vegetables. Next slide. Terry Sawyer and Hog Island Oyster Company on Tomales Bay in California. Next slide. Curtis Sales out in the eastern plains, about 2 hours east of Denver, growing grains. Next slide. Dan DeSutter, a corn farmer who's revolutionized how to grow corn and soybeans in a way that really reduces greenhouse gas emissions. He's from eastern Indiana. And then next. And then Albert Strauss and the family from Strauss Family Creamery in California. And then finally, next one, Bob Yost and the team at A1 Organics, which is based outside of Denver. There's a different chapter for each one of these. Next slide. And I think, again, I mentioned that how shocked I was to learn that 1/4 to 1/3 of the total greenhouse gas emissions that we emit as humans come from microbes. It's such an interesting and intriguing story, but they are at the center of this. Less than 15% of the total emissions from the food system come from fossil fuels. The rest of it is coming from microbes in the guts of animals and the depths of landfills, microbes in the soil. Something that surprises me to this day is that irrigation reservoirs are giant methane factories. The microbes in the depths of these consuming organic matter that settles in the bottom, and they produce methane. It's such an interesting story. And what I think is especially wonderful about it is that whereas they are a source of emissions, they're also at the center of the story to reduce those emissions and reverse them. We're drawing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere back into the soil. There's so much to learn there. All right, next slide, please. All right, so now at this point, we're going to do a little bit of an experiment. And bear with me while we do this. Can we collect the questions from the cards? And then also collect questions from the audience. Thank you for these. This is wonderful. Somebody remind me to teach you all how to do the Italian wave about plowing here when we're done, okay? Okay. Let's handle the first two here, eating less meat and meat replacements. One of the most significant discoveries, I think, since 1992 around in the greenhouse gas accounting space is the significance of the emissions from eating red meat. And this is from ruminants. And so a ruminant is basically an animal that, hello, there we go. An animal that has what we call a rumen. It's a sac, it's the first stomach, if you will. They eat grass, it goes into this first stomach, and microbes in that stomach actually consume the grass, the forage, whatever it is they've eaten, for the animal. They convert it into digestible products. The animal itself can't actually digest most of the plant matter. They can digest some of it, but the majority of it, they need the help of microbes. And this is an evolutionary relationship that goes back literally to the dinosaurs and maybe before then. And in the process of digesting that, the microbes emit methane as the waste product of their digestion. Now, when we digest food, humans and other mammals, most other animals, we release carbon dioxide as a waste product. But that you have to have oxygen available for that to happen. If the microbes in the cattle, they produce so much methane that it significantly raises. It's one of the most impactful sources of emissions in the food system. Now, this wouldn't normally be such a big deal, except that in the developed world, and especially in the United States, we eat so much meat. We have a meat-based diet. And most people in the country eat meat 3 meals a day. Now, I'm not saying this I'm not about meat shaming, and, I'm not about trying to call people out. This is just a fact of how the diet of our country and most developed countries has gone. What it means is when you eat those meat portions in the diet, they have it's going to be between 5 and 30 times the emissions of the other food products that are on the plate. So for example, if you have a pound of lentil beans and you have a pound of beef on the plate, the beef, the emissions associated with the beef or lamb is going to be about 30 times greater than the emissions from the lentils or pinto beans or other legumes like that. And it's extraordinary. One of the things I think that is so interesting, though, is that the conclusion I come to in the book is that solving that problem is not necessarily about just giving up meat. The reason is that animals play such a central role in ecosystems. And so, for example, organic agriculture depends pretty significantly upon animal manure as a fertilizer source. What we're also finding is that the grower Dan DeSutter in Indiana, who grows corn and soybeans, his entire enterprise model is based around acquiring land that's degraded and then coming in and changing how the crops are grown. And he's integrated cattle into that system. So he has what he calls a corn soybean cattle system. By integrating livestock back into the system, he can actually increase the organic matter in the soils at a rate that's about twice what it would be if he didn't have the cattle in the system. It's really interesting. So the conclusion I come to in the book is that it's not about necessarily giving up meat, but we need to examine how much meat we eat in our diets, and also consider transitioning to other sources of meat. If you're a meat eater, less beef, less lamb, convert over to things like pasture-raised poultry. Pork may have a role, but also, interestingly, we're finding that farm-raised mollusks like oysters or mussels, clams, they have the lowest carbon footprint of any animal-based protein. And it's largely because they're actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fixing it in their shells. They're taking CO2, this greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, turning it into rock in their shells that is going to persist. Short of dropping it into vats of boiling acid, that rock is going to be there forever, for all intents and purposes. What about humans? What we're learning is that, so there was a recent analysis of Beyond Burger and Impossible Burgers, and it was a life cycle assessment that looked at what we call cradle to grave emissions, from the emissions required to produce all the ingredients associated with this product, and then the emissions to actually cook it and then deal with the leftovers. Ends up being about between 4 and 5 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents for every pound of the meat replacement. Now compare that with 60 pounds of beef. It's about 15 times less. So it's pretty significantly less. Now there's other meat replacements like tempeh or tofu or other legume-based products, wheat-based products. They tend to have an emission impact of about half of what the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger would be. It's about 2 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents for every pound of the product. So the lesson there that I think that I've taken home from my own life, and what I've drawn from the scientific literature, is that we need to eat less meat. But the solution to the issue is not giving up meat completely, because livestock still have a role in farming systems and helping to reduce emissions. Okay, the question about how do we do greenhouse gas inventories? Are the emissions actually measured, or are they calculated? Are they actually modeled? It turns out that it's both. And so, for example, to try to understand how organic matter in soils is cycled and what the possibilities are about drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and storing it in soils. And this is what I spent most of my career working on, this problem. There's a network of experiments around the world. There's hundreds of them. That have been running, some of them going back to the 1840s, the longest running ecological experiment on the planet. And I feature it in the book. We actually examine those studies, and we take the measurements from those, and then we build computer models from those. We do the same thing with estimating the greenhouse gas emissions from cattle. Methane, you've probably seen photos, or maybe you've seen photos of cattle. They're walking around with these big sacks on their backs, and there's a tube that runs around and looks like they're from Mars, but it's measuring the methane that the cattle are belching out of their mouths. And there's other ways of actually measuring it. And so we take those measurements in controlled experiments, and then we apply those to the real world. Through what we call computer models, computer simulations. And it's a very similar process to how we simulate the weather and how we do projections going forward around what the climate's likely to be with increasing greenhouse gas emissions. All right, a question about eating regen locally, and how do we know if food is regeneratively grown? It's interesting, the scientific data or the scientific research around regenerative agriculture. Actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. One of the most satisfying pieces of my work has been the opportunity to work with sociologists and anthropologists, people who are actually going out into the community and interacting with people and trying to understand what people's relationships with food are, how they make food decisions, how they cook food, decisions about how they deal with the leftovers. And one of the things that has come out of that is this understanding that, especially here in the US and in the Western world, we are so isolated from farmers. There's, that saying about, well, there's so many degrees of separation. And it's difficult to know where food is coming from. But what the scientific community is learning is that when we shorten that distance, or we establish those connections back to farmers, that when the consumer has the opportunity to talk to who's growing their food, that real progress can be made around improving the quality of the food. And so you all have the opportunity to go to, let's say for the through a community-supported agriculture, a CSA, or go to the farmer's market and talk with the growers and ask them, how is the food grown? Is it grown regeneratively? Ask them about the practices. Establishing that kind of connection creates an incentive for the people growing the food to actually make the changes. If the connection is only through a grocer and then to a wholesaler and then through a distributor, it's very difficult to actually establish that connection, and the market signals are really hard to implement. But if we have that direct connection to the grower, that's actually where progress can really be made. So how do you know if your food is grown regeneratively? There are labels that are available that are coming to the fore, and I've got some examples of that coming up. All right, farmer subsidies. Do they work? The US started incentivizing agriculture back in the 1890s. That's when the first subsidies from the federal government started to appear. And that was in response to bread riots that were occurring at the time that came out of gold panics and other currency issues. A lot of politicians got thrown out of office after the bread riots occurred, and they started to pay attention. They wanted to level out the wheat supply and other food supplies in order to make sure that something like that never happened again. And that has become the norm in US agriculture and also in European and South African and Australian agriculture. One of the ways we interact and try to influence how our food is grown is through state and federal government. And in the US, we pump billions, tens of billions of dollars every year into agriculture through the federal government, through the Farm Bill. Similar sorts of things happen here in the state of Colorado. Money that's collected through taxes goes into the agriculture department and is used to incentivize growers around different practices. And we find that especially in regenerative agriculture, that there's a direct correlation between the amount of money that's made available to the growers and the uptake of practices. And one of the things I talk about in the book, kind of a wonky term, but we call cover crops. It's basically where you grow a crop after, you plant a crop after you harvest your corn or your alfalfa or whatever it might be. You grow that through the winter, up through the fall, into the winter, and then the following spring, and then terminate it, roll it down, cut it, whatever, end it, and then you plant the next crop. It has a very climate beneficial effect. And we find that the more money that we put out there for farmers to make that transition, to use that, and not just that, but lots of other practices, the more uptake there is. And just to summarize this, we find that if you provide technical assistance, connect farmers to peers that are already doing it, so people who already have a demonstrated success, and then you provide them with some financial assistance for up to about 5 years, then the practices tend to stick. There's been a lot of research around that, and whether it's through federal or state governments or through private carbon markets or other sorts of things, we find that that tends to be, that's a recipe for success. There's a question about no-till. How does no-till work? No-till is a way of growing crops without what we call dragging steel through the soil. Farmers for years, and going back to probably the very first farmer, they go through this process of tilling the soil in order to kill weeds, try to warm it up, prepare it for the next crop. That process of disturbing the soil, it introduces oxygen into the soil, it breaks up what we call soil aggregates, it also stimulates the microbes in the soil And by doing that, those combinations of those things, it leads to the microbes consuming the organic matter that's in the soil at an extreme rate. Now, we pay a lot of attention to soil in this field because soil is the largest carbon pool on the planet outside of the oceans, the deep oceans. There's more carbon in the soil, and that what a scientist named Nikiforov called the excited skin of the planet. There's more carbon in that thin layer than there is in all the forests and all the other crops and all the grasses on the planet. It's just extraordinary. And the process of disturbing the soil, and more than half the land on the planet is arable, is actually tilled through plows and discs and other sorts of implements. It drives that organic matter out. If you can grow the crops without tilling the soil, you're actually leaving out that step that stimulates the consumption, the decomposition of the organic matter in the soil. It's one of those things that farmers actually led with this. Groups of farmers back in the 1980s wanted to try to grow crops without tilling the soil because they saw the problems. They saw the issues with fertility, with runoff, all the other consequences that come from tilling the soil. And they started to develop methods to grow crops without tilling the soil. And it's one of the fastest growing regenerative practices in the US today, is this conversion over to reducing tillage. Okay, regenerative claims. We'll get to that in a minute. Organic numbers. I'm afraid I can't help you with that. I don't know how many organic growers there are in Colorado. But if you come up and talk to me afterwards, give me your information, we'll look that up, and I'll get an answer to you. Connectivity. I talked about this a little bit before, but one of the, I talk about this in the book. One of the most personal connections, short of losing your home in a flood or tornado or a fire, one of the most personal connections we have to the climate crisis is through the food on our plates. And it's also one of the most personal opportunities we have to actually help make a difference. And in particular, one of the things I was so surprised to see the numbers on this, but simply by not throwing our food in the trash, but actually composting it, getting it into a commercial compost, or composting it in your home. You're reducing emissions. You're keeping food out of the bottom of landfills where microbes, just like in the guts of livestock, microbes are consuming the organic matter and releasing methane into the atmosphere. By keeping that out of the landfill, you're stopping emissions the same way you prevent emissions if you don't drive your car. It's that simple. Thank you, Kathy. All right, and maybe we'll close with this question about crops with the most impact. Corn is the most widely grown crop in the United States today. And it has the greatest impact because there's more fertilizer that's produced to grow corn than fertilizer is used for any other crop. And it turns out the act of manufacturing fertilizer produces huge emissions. But surprisingly, applying the fertilizer to the soil, you're stimulating a feeding frenzy by microbes in the soil to produce greenhouse gases. And so the emissions from corn from fertilizing corn are some of the largest sources of emissions in the United States today. This is not to say that corn is bad. Our entire food system is built around it, and but there are significant emissions that are associated with it. All right, why don't we go ahead and move on to the close here. And can you go to the next slide, Kathy? So I want to close with this question, and I worked at a university for most of my career, so there's a quiz here. What's the most important thing we can do to ensure a safer climate future? Is it A, eliminate the use of fossil fuels, B, reduce the amount of meat we eat, C, compost our food and yard waste, or D, eat more farmed mollusks? All of the above. All right, Kathy, next. The most significant is eliminating the use of fossil fuels. But you are right, all of the above, all of these have significant impacts. And I put this up here to just make the point that we can't actually eat our way out of the climate crisis. It's not, we have to do more. We have to eliminate the use of fossil fuels. But by making these changes in regenerative agriculture, these transitions in the food system, we're going to be drawing down carbon from the atmosphere back into the Earth's ecosystems, mainly in the soil. And that is essentially mandatory. What the scientists of the IPCC have determined is that we simply have to draw down CO2 in order to prevent the climate from heating into the most dangerous levels. And the most efficient way to do it right now is through agriculture. So the good news is that the meals that we eat, the plates of food that we eat, have a role in reducing our emissions. The bad news is it's not going to get us completely out of the woods. We can't completely offset our fossil fuel emissions by changing agriculture. The two really have to go hand in hand. Next slide, please. So what can individual consumers do? Well, Michael Pollan summed it up in his wonderful book, In Defense of Food. So eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Reducing the amount of meat that we eat, probably the most significant step that we can take. Next, please. For meat eaters transitioning to pasture poultry has about 1/12 of the emissions of beef or lamb. Next slide. I keep talking about farmed mollusks, but they have a carbon footprint that is less than 1 pound of carbon dioxide equivalent, so less than 1/60th of the emissions associated with eating beef. If you don't have a shellfish allergy. Next, please. Composting your leftovers may be one of the most significant things that we can do collectively. And the city of Fort Collins is planning, and Larimer County are planning to move to a citywide composting program starting in, I think, about 18 months, 2 years, yeah. Yay. Next, please. All right. Avoiding foods that travel by air, eating foods close to home, farmers market, CSAs, or buying vegetables in your grocery that you know are labeled from local Colorado growers. That can reduce the food miles and the transportation emissions associated with it. Next slide. And then these are some labels to watch for. The regenerative organic certified label is a label that you can rely upon. And it's just like the organic label. It involves, all of these involve a certification program. And these are starting to appear on foods on your grocery shelves. All right, next slide. All right, I'll just leave you all with this quote from Barry Lopez. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. Thanks for having me. This has been a real treat. I've been on a book tour around the country and just got home last night from a trip to Chicago where I did an event. And it's really just great to be able to be here at home and also to see so many friends in the audience, people that I know, and also new friends that I'm making here tonight. So thank you all very much. Okay, I'm going to lead you all. So, all right, get your hands up. Repeat after me. Don't plow. Don't plow. Don't plow. Don't plow. Don't plow. Don't plow. All right. All right.